Hi, and welcome to the next episode of People Matter. In this episode, we're going to talk about the right to disconnect. Now, for the last 5 or so years, I've been following this particular interesting area. And it's because I was over in France in about 2017, and one of the French lawyers that we work closely at a firm called Fidel talked to me about the new right to disconnect that France was implementing, trying to tackle the slow creeping of the working day and the fact that the boundary between work and home was forever narrowing. And indeed, the blessing and the curse of the smartphone is that we can all be accessible anywhere, anytime these days. And what's made me go back and think about this again is that the pandemic has really shifted the way that we work, and that dividing line between home and work has become perhaps even narrower. And then in October of last year, Ireland became yet another country to follow France in introducing a specific right to disconnect. So that's a right that allows workers to disconnect from their company's or employers' computer systems and not to be penalised for doing so. Now, in order to try and understand how the right to disconnect is working, what I then did was I went back and spoke to Christine Pellissier, who is a partner at Fidel, the law firm that I was talking about, to try and understand how actually the right to disconnect is working in practice and what that might mean to employers who are looking at this in practical terms. There were 3 things that Christine said that really made me think. So the first was that the way they introduced the right to disconnect in France was to place the burden on employers to disconnect all staff. So it wasn't, I'd like to object to connecting, so to speak. You didn't have to fill in out a form. The burden passed automatically to all employers to disconnect staff. And Christine was telling me that that actually imposed quite a burden. So employers were thinking about the technology they needed to implement to disconnect staff or to restrict access from the office. And to truth be told, when Christine was talking to me about that, I had a fear that if this was me and this was Mills Reeve, I'd be stuck somewhere in the London office because I was busy and hadn't noticed that the entire system had been locked down. But in all seriousness, the issue of having this right to disconnect on a company-wide basis is that it presupposes that we work like we did when my own dad was working in Norwich for an insurance company, and he worked 9 till 6. Whereas the modern world's far more complicated. There's far more working patterns. There's also flexible working patterns where people are working specific days or specific hours that I think causes so many practical issues in devising a company-wide policy around disconnecting. The second thing that Christine talked to me about was that there was no specific penalty for a breach of the right to disconnect in France. In actual fact, what it turned out was that the right to disconnect has been one of the things that is often added into an existing form of litigation. So she mentioned that people would bring the right to disconnect up when they were saying, look, I haven't received my right to 11 hours uninterrupted rest break that people are entitled to under the Working Time Directive across the EU and in the UK under the Working Time Regulations. So effectively the right to disconnect was supplementing what was already there. It wasn't breaking any new ground. It was just trying to adjust an existing right that's there to protect our health, safety, well-being, the freshness we have in the workplace into a different concept. So it kind of fell into the bucket that I often come across, which is where we give something a really fancy title like the right to disconnect, and what we actually mean is we should go back to the existing legislation, so in our case the Working Time Regulations, and say, okay, if we thought it was a great idea for an uninterrupted rest break of 11 hours, how can we adapt that to the age of the smartphone? The third thing that came out quite clearly was that in some respects the right to disconnect was just very inflexible. So she gave an example that during the pandemic, many of the employer clients that would phone Christine and would say, look, Christine, we need to know how the right to disconnect works because a bunch of employees have asked us now for a bit of flexibility in the day and we don't quite know how that works. They might want to go out and run some errands for someone they were caring for, or deal with a child caring emergency that came up, as we all had during the pandemic. And the advice Christine gave was really simple. Of course, you can agree this. It's not in line with what the law actually required. You were required to disconnect people, and you've got a system that doesn't give you flexibility. And it's okay so long as there's not any issues. And for me, although when Ireland implemented the right to disconnect, they came with it completely different and said, look, you should try and have some communication. The whole issue with the right to disconnect is this. What you're trying to solve is an issue of balance. So you are trying to allow people to work differently in the modern concept, but balancing those two things of not allowing people to be overworked and therefore overstressed, but also respecting an element of flexibility that has come to be part and parcel of how we work these days. And indeed, if you were to have a blunt tool that gave everyone an ability to disconnect at a certain time, you may cut some of that flexibility, which could be bad for those people that need an element of wriggle room in their working day. So where does that leave us in terms of the right to disconnect within the UK? Well, I personally wouldn't be supporting a call to have a specific right to disconnect, but I do think that there is something that needs to be done to avoid the creeping of the working day causing issues around staff welfare and indeed of creating some difficult conversations around workplace issues. So I think you need to do three things. So the first is an easy thing. We know from all of the holiday pay case law that a key thing is to ensure that people take their mandatory holiday, because that's where you have the opportunity to recharge, refresh. So making sure that people take annual leave and not read emails and properly disconnect during that period of time, I think is essential. And certainly thinking about how the city does things, so mandating a compulsory 2-week period of leave may well be something that's quite sensible. The second thing is, and this is the hardest thing, is something I mentioned when Ireland was implementing a right to disconnect, is around thinking about your communication. So what are the expectations in terms of work outside of your normal contractual hours? But then drilling into it, what about the expectations and the different working patterns within your team? So if you've got someone that picks up the extra hour or so that they might want to do, but they took a break to do the kids' pick up from school, well, the fact they're working then, should they be sending emails to their team? Should they put them in their delayed delivery? How should that be dealt with to avoid the choices you make in terms of when and how you work, creating expectation that others that work differently should extend their working hours to be online at the same time as you? And the final thing is to then promote mental health and well-being, because essentially the right to disconnect is all about ensuring that our in-work presence doesn't become excessive. And actually that's about leaders leading the right example, and it's about ensuring that we respect mental health boundaries and actually we have a pleasant working environment. So I don't think there's a right to disconnect, but I think there's a call for us to think about things a little differently than perhaps we do at the moment. So that's all I've got time for, and speak to you next time on People Matters.